Well, let's get you more on the latest efforts to bolster the fight against militancy in the Sahel region. I'm joined in our Johannesburg studios by Professor John Stremlau. He's an international relations expert from Wits University. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor. Is the G5 force the silver bullet in dealing with terrorism and security in the Sahel?
Well, thank you very much for taking this topic and the time for it, because it's very important, but there is no silver bullet for the Sahelian region. It is one of the most problematic in the world, and yet, it's very important to have this initiative move forward, in part because it is the African countries themselves, the G5 countries themselves, Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger, that are setting the agenda and trying to get international support. This is what China often asks for, rightly so, that if it's going to be any kind of peace in that region, it has to be African-led and African-legitimized.
And what has made the war against terror so difficult in this region?
Well, that's a very good question, because it's not simple. It's being cast often in the American press and by the American president, who wants to think of this as purely anti-terrorism. There's a confluence of major problems in this region, starting with climate change and desertification, which is causing great stress among the population there. The population itself is poor, but it's exploding. Large families, and governance is weak. The institutions of governance are weak. And then you do have these extremists floating in from the Middle East, the ISIS people with money, and they find some willing recruits. But you cannot address this problem unless you do so comprehensively. And I think what the G5 is saying and engaging the UN and the principal donors to talk about is, how do we get a more systematic and sustained approach to deal with this terribly difficult problem?
Well, as you say there, it needs to be comprehensive. What specifically can be done to assist the region in this fight against terrorism?
Well, it's very hard to talk specifics and quick solutions. I'd rather think of this as a process that needs to get underway. And here China's voice is very important, and I think China should be, in fact, more prominent in the multilateral approach to doing this solution in the long term. The process that has been started 3 years ago and now has had the first military operation and is trying to secure the very insecure borders between Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso as a first objective, that is requiring assistance from France, from Germany, and Chancellor Merkel is at this meeting in Paris, which is a good sign. I'm a little concerned about the Saudi Arabia and Emirates money, because that's Sunni money, and you don't want to over-politicize this, but there is money that's needed. The United States is doing bilateral assistance and is not as cooperative as it could be, but China has taken the line. And I note that this is really important because the representative Chambeau in New York said that for the Africans to set the agenda, we have to listen very carefully and then respond in that way. So that's the process I'd like to see working. I might add, by the way, that China has also stressed it needs to be studied. The problems need to be studied and analyzed by people who know the region well. And there was a delegation recently that included some representatives from AFRICOM, arranged by the Carter Center, to Beijing in October to talk about the Sahelian security problems, and that is led by Mohammed Shambas, who is the UN Special Representative for the Sahel in West Africa. And what China said in hosting this meeting in Beijing during October was that let's hear first and foremost from the African representatives, and they were a very strong delegation, and then invited this group of Americans and Chinese security experts to West Africa in February or March to be part of this conversation. That's a win-win for everybody, but it also is a confidence-building measure between China and the United States, as well as with the Europeans. And if this crisis in the Sahel can lead to that confidence building among the major powers, including China, that would be a positive in addition to dealing with the local circumstances, which first and foremost have to be an African solution for African problems.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, your insight there. That was Professor John Stremlau from an international relations expert from Wits University.